Well, thank you very much, Professor Frame, General Sir Peter Cosgrove, General Simon, General Mark Kelly, other distinguished participants in the East Timor operation some 20 years ago. Ladies and gentlemen, can I join others in thanking Raytheon for sponsoring this seminar and for its ongoing contribution to the defence capability of Australia. Professor Frame is absolutely right to contextualise the East Timor intervention of 20 years ago in the shadow of Vietnam. And I say that conscious that there are people in this room, such as General Cosgrove, who served with great distinction in Vietnam. And I acknowledge, of course, that it was a searing domestic, political and human debate at the time. And any of us who were involved in different ways in political exchange will remember that. I think it's fair to say that the late 1970s represented the high watermark of people going quiet about Australia's great military achievements and great military traditions. There was even talk in those days that Anzac Day would die out. It seems incredible to recall that now, given the way in which the military history and traditions of this country have been re-embraced, in my view, very warmly by a younger generation. So that was one of the context points, I suppose, that we faced, although it is fair to say that as we moved into the 80s and 90s, other forces were at work. The end of the Cold War, of course, was highly significant, and that was to play something of a role in the interaction that I had with President Clinton at the time we were putting together the INTERFET intervention. And of course I should acknowledge the very successful participation in the Cambodian peacekeeping operation. The Australian contribution to that was led very effectively by General John Sanderson, and it occurred under the aegis of our predecessor government to mine. And I think that reflected well on Australian diplomacy and Australian military capacity, and I freely acknowledge that. The other context point is that the incorporation of East Timor into the Indonesian Republic remained on the conscience of Australia, remained on the conscience of Australia for a very long period of time. And one of the remarkable things about it that impressed me at the time and continues to do so was the spectrum of sympathy and sentiment towards the people of East Timor. Those who had been involved in World War II or close to people involved in World War II, particularly those who'd been captured in Timor, remembered with great affection the support they received from the East Timorese people. In a political context, the Australian Labor Party, which of course was in government for a very long period of time between the incorporation and the INTERFET force, was divided. The left wing of that party never warmed to General Suharto. The left wing of the Labor Party felt that there had been far too savage a series of reprisals against particularly the Chinese population in Indonesia after the rise to power of General Suharto in the middle 1960s. And thirdly, partly because of the Portuguese provenance of East Timor, the Catholic Church was very strong in advocating a fairer deal. So these were elements that were present as we began as a government after the 1998 election to address whether there ought to be a policy change. And I have to stress that from the time of the incorporation of East Timor into the Indonesian Republic in 1975, it could be said that it was a bipartisan constant that we should continue to recognise the sovereignty of Indonesia over East Timor. And any idea that there was a clear political divide on that issue from 1975 until 1999, can I say, is erroneous. As a member of the Fraser government, after 1975, I well recall debate about the relationship between East Timor and Jakarta, and it's fair to say that the doctrine of keeping Jakarta happy prevailed on both sides of Australian politics. And it was the dominant stream of advice coming to Australia, coming to the government from both the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade and also the Prime Minister's Department. Now, I don't suggest for a moment that it was because of the advice we received that we embraced the policy. It was a policy that was freely embraced through those years, and it was certainly the policy that my government endorsed when I became Prime Minister in 1996. I well remember the first visit I paid to Jakarta in 1996. It was in fact my first official visit to any country after I'd become Prime Minister. And I well recall being met at the airport by Ali Alatas, who was then the Indonesian Foreign Minister. We talked about what I might discuss with President Suharto, and we talked about East Timor, and we talked about how much time we might spend talking about East Timor. I made it clear that I would be raising concerns we had about the behaviour of some of the militia and TNI associated elements, if I can put it that way, in East Timor. And there had been a number of incidents, and of course there had been the history of the atrocity in the cemetery, and of course it still hung very heavily in Australian circles, the murder of the journalists several years before. It was an issue that underlay a great deal of the discussion. So I mention those things to make the point that up until events began to accelerate in 1998 and 1999, there was a bipartisan policy because it was, I suppose, the prevailing wisdom that you defined engagement with Asia by how good your relations were with Jakarta. That seemed to be the attitude that was prevailing. Now, that may seem, in retrospect, to have been a falsely based approach, but that was the prevailing mood at the time. So we now come through to 1998, and of course the really significant development, in my view, was the replacement, in political terms, the replacement of General Suharto by the recently deceased B.J. Habibie. I think there is an enormous amount of symbolism as well as historical truth in that rather moving photograph of Xanana Gusmao speaking to the dying President Habibie, no doubt expressing the gratitude of his country. Because Habibie had a different attitude. He had a different attitude about a lot of things. He'd spent many years of his earlier life working for the Messerschmitt Corporation out of the country. He had none of the emotional attachment to East Timor remaining part of the Indonesian Republic that was entertained by people like General Wiranto and others in the Indonesian establishment. He thought East Timor was a burden. Put it bluntly, he thought East Timor was a burden for Indonesia. And then on top of that, international opinion began to move on the issue. And it was felt that the time perhaps had come to reassess the relationship between Indonesia and East Timor. But of course, none of us were prepared, even after we had a meeting of the National Security Committee of Cabinet, none of us were prepared for the speed with which Dr. Habibie moved. He went further. We didn't ask that he have a referendum on independence, complete separation. We asked that he move rather more cautiously. And of course, that at the time did represent a very significant change of policy by the Australian government. And it was a change of policy that was embraced more or less across the political divide at the time. There were plenty of people within the ranks of the then opposition who were very happy to see us adopt a different attitude towards Jakarta, and of course there were many in our own ranks who were in precisely the same situation. So it was at that point that, as is known, I wrote that letter to Dr. Habibie suggesting that he might consider having a referendum to test the attitude to provide greater autonomy within the Indonesian Republic for the people of East Timor. He not only agreed to that, but of course he agreed, as history is recorded, to go a great deal further. And as a consequence, he decided to hold the referendum. And he must be given enormous credit for doing that, because it was not a popular decision within his own government. It was a very unpopular decision. I remember after one of the apparent atrocities involving the murder of some citizens of East Timor, I rang Dr. Habibie and asked that I come to see him in Dili, which I did. And I had an hour and a half meeting with him in which there were no advisors on either side present. And he took a far greater risk at that meeting than I did, because it was conducted in English, and my capacity to converse with him, or indeed anybody else, in any other language was non-existent. But he took the risk, to his enormous credit, but it obviously discomforted the then Defence Minister, General Wiranto, and many of his others. It was during that meeting that I asked that we be allowed to send some peacekeepers in to help preserve the peace, for the most obvious reasons, because sporadic atrocities were occurring and elements of the TNI seemed to be completely out of control. He understandably rejected that, although he did agree to the insertion of more police, and as a result there were additional officers of the Australian Federal Police included in the United Nations supervised contingent of police. It's interesting to note that as the months went by in 1999, more and more people began calling on the government to just get on with it and intervene. And of course, one had to remind talkback radio callers and many others that for the government to, quote, get on with it and intervene would have actually amounted to an invasion of Indonesia. And because East Timor was still part of the Republic of Indonesia, and unless and until the government was able to secure the blessing of the Indonesian government for the insertion of an INTERFET force, then of course it would have amounted to an invasion, and our whole diplomatic thrust was to try and bring that about. It's at this point, of course, that I began to engage more, and my Foreign Minister, Alexander Downer, began to engage more fully with the United Nations. Now, I have not, as many of you will know, been, how shall I put it, a completely uncritical commentator on the activities of the United Nations. I think the United Nations, 5 minutes left, okay. The United Nations has done some very good work, but the involvement of the United Nations, and very particularly the involvement of the Security Council in obtaining the passage of a resolution authorising the intervention, was absolutely crucial. I think the most conspicuous feature of the INTERFET force that we assembled more than 20 years ago was that it was not just a white European force, it was a genuine multinational regional force. The second largest contingent, from my recollection, after that of Australia and New Zealand, was Thailand, and Thailand made a very large contribution. We had contributions from South Korea. Disappointingly, we thought we might have a contribution from Malaysia, but that was stymied by somebody who's returned to active service in that country in recent times. But I won't allow myself to get diverted on that subject, particularly as I've only got 5 minutes left. Can I say that? But in the end, the involvement of the United Nations was absolutely fundamental. And I want to thank Andrew Peacock, who is still then our ambassador in the United States, and also the advice he received from the late Richard Holbrooke, who negotiated the Dayton Accords that ended the Bosnian War. And Holbrooke said, for heaven's sake, make sure that the resolution that goes to the UN is a blanket resolution, so we don't have a terrible repetition of the tragedy of the Dutch at Srebrenica, where because of the inadequacy of the mandate, they were unable to intervene. So I wanted to particularly record that. Could I just say one final thing about the involvement of others? It is true that when I first spoke to President Clinton, I was disappointed that there would be no American boots on the ground. I say in tribute to him that he got the message that we were unhappy, and he made up for the absence of the boots on the ground with a great deal of logistic and other support. And it was a reminder to me of his capacity as a leader, as a president, most powerful country in the world, to respond to the legitimate concerns of close friends and allies. But I can also say that I learned a lot about the history of the world since 1989, when he spelled out in detail during that telephone conversation just how large had been the peace dividend that the Americans had taken out of expenditure and so forth on their military as a result of the end of the Cold War. Of course, the military operation was a great success. We didn't know that at the time, and it's very easy to look back and say, gee, wasn't that clever? But of course, we didn't know it at the time. And I do want to, in sparing his blushes, pay tribute to Peter Cosgrove for the leadership he provided, and also Mark Kelly and others. I think during that period of time, it's no exaggeration to say that a whole new generation of Australians acquired a great affection and respect for the men and women of the Australian Defence Force. They weren't indifferent, they weren't hostile previously, perhaps they had been a little different. And they were reminded of what good things the men and women of our armed forces could do. And of course they were reminded in the end that it can be done in a way that combines military efficiency and effectiveness with humanitarian understanding. I think the Australian people were pleased how things worked out in East Timor. And can I just finish with a small anecdote? One of the things I had to do during this period of time was to present the trophy for the NRL. And as some of you may know, I follow the St George Illawarra Dragons. And of course they played, right in the middle of this, they played the grand final against the Melbourne Storm. And St George were leading 14-0 at half time, but ended up losing. And I had the I had to present the trophy. It was not the last time that I was unhappily photographed presenting a trophy, but we went well on that. But I presented the trophy to Glenn Lazarus, who later, of course, became Senator Lazarus in the Australian Parliament. He was the captain of the Melbourne Storm, but to his enormous credit, before saying anything about the game, he paid tribute, because it was just a few days earlier our troops had gone in to East Timor. He paid tribute to the men and women who were involved in that intervention, and that is what the Australian public wanted him to do and say, because the Australian public was very proud of it. Now, Tom, I've exceeded my time, but I often do, but thank you very much.
So, Mr. Howard, President Habibie's response to your letter about an act of self-determination for East Timor, that was not what you thought it would be. What did you do after 1999 to better place yourself in and the government so that East Timor, Indonesian attitudes would be perhaps more accurately known?
I think, Tom, that was a case where Habibie acted not consistent with Indonesian attitudes to date, but also almost in defiance of them. I don't think any amount of better intelligence or better understanding of the attitude of the Indonesian government would have better equipped us to deal with them. We didn't think he'd do that, and neither did General Wiranto, neither did the whole Indonesian establishment, neither indeed did either of his two immediate successors, because in a way nobody had expected him to become president of Indonesia. It was the impact of the Asian financial meltdown that really undermined Suharto's position and was the final straw that brought about Suharto's removal and mobilised the forces within Indonesia to bring about a change.
So erratic or unpredictable?
Well, both. In the eyes of the Indonesian establishment, he was erratic and unpredictable. In the eyes of people who were a lot more sympathetic to him, he was unpredictable.
Thank you. These are your questions. Please wait for the microphone to come to. We'll go to the back and then to Superior in the front. Or perhaps Superior.
Thank you. I keep defaulting to call you Prime Minister. John, there's been some odd commentary recently from a US source, apparently, that the government was sort of kicking and screaming towards that intervention. And that's an odd statement, because from my perspective then, I was seeing something else entirely. I think you've mainly answered that, but I'd love you to speak about the behind the scenes stuff that was happening from the time you got Habibie's letter.
Well, it's fair to say that there has been a little bit of that effect, placing great store on the then Defence Secretary William Cohen's visit to Jakarta, in which he made it very plain that America would be mightily displeased if any grief came to the INTERFET force. Now, that's an entirely fair proposition. I've always acknowledged that the Americans, once they realised that we expected them to do a bit more than just a token contribution of logistic support, the Americans worked overtime to render assistance. And as you know, it was fortuitous that we had the APEC meeting in New Zealand, and just at the time the whole United Nations part of the exercise was coming to a head, we had this meeting where I was able to talk in some detail with President Clinton, and the coordinating minister from Indonesia was there, and it was at that meeting that we finally got the word that Ali Alatas was on his way to New York to indicate with the Security Council of the UN that Indonesia would consent to the injection of the force. But it's fair to say that in the Australian government, it was East Timor that saw for the first time the full value of the fairly recently established National Security Committee of Cabinet. One of the cabinet committees that we established when we were elected was the National Security Committee, and it comprised the Prime Minister, the Deputy Prime Minister, the Treasurer, the Defence Minister, the Foreign Minister, on most occasions, but not always, the Attorney General. But crucially, it also included the companion officials, the head of Prime Minister's Defence, the CDF, head of Foreign Affairs, the head of ONA, and the head of ASIO, and on many occasions the head of the Australian Federal Police. And I've got to say that of all of the structures that I established, it worked better than any. And it really did work overtime in East Timor. It met some occasions on a virtually daily basis, and it was the forerunner of many similar occasions, particularly in relation to Afghanistan and Iraq and the Solomon Islands, where the same thing happened. We were surprised, but not a little, we're really quite pleased at Habibie's reaction. It did go further than we expected, and Alexander Downer worked very, very hard on the diplomatic front to see the opportunity for the act of self-determination to take place under the aegis of the United Nations, to involve, consistent with what we call the Matignon Accords, to involve in a fairly nominal sort of way the Portuguese, because of their historical association with the East Timorese. So it worked very well, and of course it worked against the background of people constantly saying that we had to get on with it. And as said earlier, I spent a lot of time on this subject, as I did a lot of others, on Talkback Radio, and to have people ring up and say, look, you've just got to get in there, Prime Minister, and fix it. And when I tried to explain to them, well, that would involve invading Indonesia. Oh no, don't worry about that. That was a fairly big call to ignore technically invading. But once Habibie went the distance, there was no holding back the efforts that we exercised, and apart from a few in what I might call the foreign affairs commentariat, the great bulk of opinion in Australia moved very strongly in favour of us being involved in any intervention.
Thank you. The final question at the back.
Ben Packham with the Australian newspaper. Mr. Howard, thank you for your address. Clearly, the Australian people and you personally have great affection for Timor-Leste and the challenges it's had. I'm just wondering if you could talk about perhaps the future of Timor-Leste. It is looking for some serious funding, up to $16 billion, to support a major gas development, onshore gas development. It's talking to China about securing that investment, and strategically this has alarmed a number of analysts and thinkers who suggest that it could result in Timor-Leste falling into a Chinese debt trap or some such predicament. I'm just wondering what your thoughts are on how Australia should view Timor-Leste's future. Should we do our best to support them in their endeavours to build a domestic gas industry, and what dangers there would be for Australia if Timor-Leste were to default on a very large Chinese loan?
I think the government has stated a fairly sound approach to what might be called the Chinese factor, as far as smaller nations in our region are concerned, particularly in the Pacific. And I think Scott Morrison has stated our national interest well. We obviously have great national interest in having good relations with China. It's only a matter of common sense, our largest trading destination. As far as East Timor itself is concerned, there remains a special affection in the Australian community and a sense of obligation. If you are heavily involved in securing the independence of a small country, you have an ongoing obligation. As to the specifics of how we express that, I think I will leave that to those who now make these decisions. I don't want to complicate their already challenging life anymore with remarks that might be seen, however, unintended to be a little ambiguous. I'll leave that. I think they've probably got the balance pretty right. But one thing I won't leave that I should do, and it relates to relations between Australia and another country, and that is to record my appreciation for the speedy way in which the newly elected Labor Prime Minister of New Zealand, Helen Clark, endorsed the decision that had been taken by her Nationals predecessor, Jenny Shipley, to contribute a Kiwi battalion to the INTERFET force. There were some concerns, because Helen Clark and I were a fair distance apart politically, not just in the formal sense, but she was on the left wing of the Labor Party, and I have sometimes been accused of being slightly more centre-right than some of my other colleagues in my own party. But she very readily, as soon as she was elected, I rang her and said, I hope you'll keep the New Zealand battalion, greatly appreciated by General Cosgrove and others, and she said, yes, we certainly will. And throughout the whole time that the operation continued, she was very, very cooperative and very helpful to work with. And I just wanted to record my recognition that across political divides and other differences of opinion, where the national interest of close cooperation between Australia and New Zealand required her to act in a way she certainly did.
Please join with me. Thank you, Mr.